Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is Sunday, day 249. And I have no idea what the date is, but that's okay. We know it's Sunday and we know it's day 249 of TowerGate. Today I just want to, I should say this evening, I just want to focus on something I think is really being underplayed in the corporate news media. And I know there's a lot of things going on right now with Trump's Asia trip and all the other things going on. But I think that the events that are unfolding in Saudi Arabia are being greatly underreported. They're not being really examined as closely as they should be for how important this is, what is happening there in Saudi Arabia. This is huge. In fact, I would say that if this turns out to be what I think it is, then this will be the greatest foreign policy maneuver since the Louisiana Purchase. And the reason I say that is because let's look at the big picture for a minute, and then I'll get into some of the smaller details. The big picture here is that we know that Saudi Arabia funds about 70% of the madrasas and the expansion of the Wahhabist radical Islamic theory of Islam. It is they are the #1 player in the world by far. There is no one even close. So when you think about ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all the terrorists and all this stuff and where that money comes from, where they get radicalized, where all this comes from, it comes from these rogue elements of the Saudi royals. I mean, who was bin Laden? He was a Saudi royal. You look at the hijackers, most of them were Saudis, the alleged hijackers. They turned out, in my mind, to be patsies, but they were essentially, and of course we learned from the 28 pages that were, even though there was quite a few redactions, when we did get those 28 pages from the 9/11 event recently, we found out that Prince Bandar was the main person, the main point of interest throughout that entire series of pages, of the 28 pages. It was about the fact that Bandar, basically his #1 man in San Diego for Saudi intelligence, was essentially handling 3 of the alleged 9/11 terrorists. And it looks an awful lot like Prince Bandar had his hand in the entire operation, otherwise known as Bandar Bush. We know that he was in town quite a bit in the weeks leading up to 9/11. We know he was out there at Bush's ranch having a little barbecue. But when you look at the overall Saudi issue, you're talking about these radical elements of the Saudi royals fund about 70% of the mosques and of the funding for terrorism around the world when you're talking about this radical Islamic terrorism. Now, let's go back to the presidential primaries back when Trump was campaigning as a candidate. He's talked a lot about the Saudis. He personally got into a Twitter war with bin Alal, the one Saudi we just talked about a couple days ago, who was horribly corrupt, involved and arrested. Who donated $25 million to the Clinton campaign, many millions of dollars to the Clinton Global Initiative, contributed to the Clinton Foundation, the whole 9 yards. Now, if you remember, him and Trump got into a little tweet back and forth, and he tweeted to bin Alal that, yeah, well, once I'm in the White House, your daddy's money will not buy you influence there anymore. And Trump was calling out the Saudis constantly. He talked about the fact that they probably had a role in 9/11 and all this type of stuff. So Trump is definitely known about the Saudis and their involvement and about how they are the primary source of spreading radical Islamic fundamentalism, Wahhabism, around the world. And then absolutely the #1 funders of these madrasas where they teach this radical Islamic hate. So now that we have that in context of how important a player Saudi Arabia is in funding and promoting terrorism, let's take a look at the impact that they have here in the United States. They are by far the #1 biggest influencer in the United States. Obviously, because we have an arrangement with them with the petrodollar. They sell millions and millions of barrels of oil, and they sell it in dollars. This is a deal that was cut back in the 70s after we left the gold standard. We, instead of backing our dollar with gold, we began backing our dollar with oil. And all we had to do was get the Saudis to agree that they would make sure that anyone buying oil from OPEC, which they control, would have to buy in dollars. So, this gives them a tremendous amount of influence. We know that the Saudis are heavily invested in the United States all across the entire range of where you can invest, whether it's real estate, investing in large media corporations. We also learned, if it was like 10 years ago, we learned that they actually make cash payments to large media organizations not to run negative stories on them. We know about the incredible amount of money that they donate to the ruling elite, the Bushes, the Clintons. Remember, 25% of Hillary Clinton's war chest was Saudi money. We know how much they donated to the Obamas. We know about the $10 million watches and rings and necklaces that they give as gifts to American presidents, Bush, Clinton, Obama, the whole 9 yards. Our deep ties with the Saudi regime covers 6 or 7 presidents going back. So there is probably no country that influences and has influenced the United States with their money any more than the Saudis. They have got to be number one. China, obviously is a major player, and when you talk about trade and trade imbalances and all these other things, but mostly what the Chinese are about is making money in business. For the Saudis, it's totally something different. It's about expanding their influence around the world with their radical ideology. And too many American presidential regimes have been happy to sit back and take the money while at the same time allowing them to promote this, which leads to all these wars, which they have no problem with because they profit from them too. Pelosi, her husband, is a defense contractor. He's made tons of money. The Bushes made tons of money. Cheney made tons of money. Even Obama, even the Clintons, they all make tons of money. This feeds the military-industrial complex. This money flows back into their campaigns, flows back into their political parties. It's one big racket. And I think Donald Trump understood that the key to draining the swamp in the United States was first you got to drain the swamp in Saudi Arabia because that's the source of the money. The mother's milk of politics, it's in Saudi Arabia. That is where the root is. If you want to uproot the deep state in the United States, you have to cut out the funding. You have to go right for the soft underbelly and hit them where they are. And so I think that Trump, back very early on, understood that the number one issue he was going to be dealing with was this terrorism. He understands what it's doing to the economy. He understands what it's doing to our freedoms and everything else. And I think he's the first president that's actually really serious about defeating this radical Islamic terror that we see around the world and has, of course, taken place here in the States on multiple occasions and continues and will continue unless it's stopped. So I think that this was number one high on Trump's agenda. And obviously, he has had good communications with the current Saudi king. And this is where we get into some of the more sticky details of everything. But the big picture here to take away from all this is that if you can get the Saudi regime, if you can make them change the way that they're doing business, cause them to stop funding all this radical terrorism, funding these madrasas, advancing this cause of Wahhabism, if you can get them to do that, you can literally defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And we see we've made major moves, major advances since Trump has been president. But he wants to win this fight. He's not messing around. He's not talking about, yeah, this will go on and on and on, and after I'm president, it'll go on and on and on. I think Trump actually believed that he could defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and it looks like this is his plan to do it. That's what it looks like to me. And if he is successful, if in 2020 he's running for re-election and Al-Qaeda and ISIS are nowhere to be seen, and every time they pop their head up, they get it shot off, this will be an historic situation. Again, it will be the biggest foreign policy success since the Louisiana Purchase, maybe bigger than that, because we're talking about the peace and security of the entire planet, which is, being threatened by this radical ideology. So this is why it is so important, and why it doesn't surprise me that the corporate media doesn't want to pay attention, because they know Trump's winning. They know he's winning against the terrorists. And this is a masterstroke. Now, how did all this come about? I am not sure. But we can certainly read some things into it. We know, again, about how much Trump focused on the corrupt Saudi regime and them funding terrorism. We know we got the 28 pages, and that told us a lot about Bandar Bush and his role in 9/11. And of course, now there are many lawsuits in Saudi Arabia. You're able to sue the Saudi government over 9/11. And that's because a bill they passed in Congress. And the Saudis cannot like that. So now let's take a look at some of the other things that are basically going on as this Saudi purge continues. First of all, just a real quick little background for you on how things work in the Saudi kingdom, excuse me, and how they have worked for a very long time, since the founding of the first modern king. When the first modern king of Saudi Arabia came along, he had 3 wives, 3 legitimate wives, not to mention other concubines. He had 45 children. And these children were across 4 different, what we call here in America, sects, but what they refer to in Saudi Arabia as clans. So he had children in 4 different clans. So naturally, as all his children became princes and became part of the ruling family, as this situation played out, king after king after king, and all their kids became princes, and all from these 4 different clans, naturally there was infighting between them, because each of these clans has slightly different ideas about things, and slightly different beliefs and various things like that. So there was conflict from the very beginning with the very first modern Saudi king. Now, he also did something, though, to try to keep this thing from collapsing in on itself. He came up with a plan whereby the order of succession would automatically allow each of the 4 different clans to have one of their guys become king in this rotation sort of thing, so that it would be fair, so that the 4 clans wouldn't start fighting one another and orchestrate coups and palace coups and things like that. So they had this sort of circle of succession that was created by this first Saudi king. And this is but it doesn't mean that it kept them from having a lot of infighting and a lot of jealousies and a lot of things going on within the various princes, of which currently there's about 4,000 princes. But this all dates back to the very beginning of the modern Saudi kingdom, and the fact that this first ruling king had 45 kids from all 4 different clans that you find there in Saudi Arabia, and that's the truth even today. Now, so back in 2015, King Abdullah dies, and so King Salman takes over. Now, King Salman broke this chain of succession. He also did something that kind of threw things into a tizzy. He made his young 30-year-old son, Prince Mohammed, the next ruler to the throne. Now, Salman's like 79, 80 years old, so eventually young Prince Mohammed, who's like 31 years old right now, will eventually become king here in the not-too-distant future. But a lot of things happened. There was no major purging or anything like that. He just reshuffled a lot of the positions in government. Once Salman took over, he put his young 30-year-old son over 4 of the most important ministries in the country. He reshuffled the deck with a lot of other people. He ended the chain of succession, and he began mild reforms. Now, his son, Prince Mohammed, who will eventually become King Mohammed, he's actually a much more of a reformer than his father is. And he kind of embraces Western values. He's a lot more of a Western thinking type Saudi leader, and wants to really change Saudi Arabia and make it more like a more modern Muslim state. A lot of the things that are old traditions there, he wants to change. And so he's meeting some resistance. His father understands that, and that's why he reshuffled the deck. and put people who think a lot and support Mohammed in charge. So this is what began happening in 2015. Okay, so then we have the 2016 elections. Trump runs. He's talking about all this stuff. And then what happens when Trump's elected president? His very first trip that he takes, outside the United States is to Saudi Arabia. Not only does he go to Saudi Arabia, but he brings his entire cabinet to Saudi Arabia. He also has multiple meetings, including one meeting that was supposed to last 2 hours. It went 4.5 hours with King Salman. And he's got all of his people there. So I think that this plan was probably set in place from day one when Trump got into office, and the first time he met with King Salman and his son, Prince Mohammed. I think he basically laid it out for him, which is, look, you guys fund most of the terrorism, you build these radical madrasas, you fund this Wahhabism, and the last 4 or 5 presidents have propped you up. I'm not going to do that. You are either going to clean up this act over here, or I'm going to let you fall. And I think Salman, probably him and his son, Prince Mohammed, probably say, hey, look, we're reformers. We're already making changes. We admit, all this stuff. We know we got a lot of bad players here. A lot of the princes here are bad characters. They're doing all this kind of stuff. We're going to take care of it. And I think Trump just applied a lot of pressure, and he cut a great deal. And Salman and his family, royal family, want to stay in power. Their power is always under threat, as is any of these kings in Saudi Arabia, because of the infighting and the pressures outside that they're facing from Shia Muslims and from Iran and from everywhere else. So obviously it was a matter of King Salman and his son of survival, really. And so they really didn't have much choice but to take the deal. But now Prince Mohammed and probably King Salman understand that the jig is up, that Trump cannot be bought like all the previous other presidents. And he really does want to defeat radical Islamic terror, and the root cause of it is the spread of Wahhabism, which is what they spread there in Saudi Arabia. It's what they teach in their madrasas. So I think Trump, in no uncertain terms, laid it out for King Salman and his son and said, look, this is what's going to happen. I'm telling you right now, these games are over. And in doing so, he's gotten King Salman to go along. And you can see the results. We're now learning that there's over 500 of these princes, military people, and people holding high government positions who've been rounded up. It's being reported that they're being tortured for information and various other things. And the biggest 2 fish they got, of course, was bin Allah, and of course we're now learning Bandar Bush. Bandar Bush, I'm sure the Bushes right now are some very nervous people, because Bandar Bush knows a lot of things, which we covered in the previous video. But this is a much bigger story, and I think there's a lot more here than what's being covered. And again, I know there's things going on in the news right now with Trump's Asia trip and his tweet storm back and forth with Kim Jong-un, which is quite funny, and all the other things going on. But this story should be getting much more play, and I realize that they don't want to give Trump any credit for anything, but if in 4 years from now, and it's very likely that in 4 years from now, you could see this battle with the war on terror could be practically won by 2020. Because once you cut off their money and their support, which is provided, most of it by the Saudis, you've pretty much got them defeated. And they're already on the run. That, combined with turning the military loose and letting them actually go after these guys, you're talking about a deadly 1-2 punch that could knock these guys out. And this is something that most people thought even a year ago was impossible. Most people thought, no, we're just going to be living with radical Islamic terror for the next 5,000 years or whatever. That was never going to end. Trump believes he can win this fight, and this is exactly how you win this fight. You cut off the money and the people who are bankrolling it. And I would say that that's what this purge is all about in Saudi Arabia. Yes, some of it is to do with King Salman wanting to protect his family and their clan, to have them maintain power, to get his son in power so that he can make these reforms. And but in the process of doing that, they understand that if they want to stay legitimate, if they want to stay in power, they have to stop funding. Muhammad's also very smart in a sense that he understands what previous Saudi leaders didn't, which is that the idea that you can live off nothing but your oil wealth for the rest of your days is not a good plan. They understand that they have to start diversifying. They have to get other things going on in that economy. And Prince Mohammed understands that. His father understands that. So we're seeing a major shift that's happening right now in Saudi Arabia that has spanned 6-7 presidential administrations, going back to the early 1970s when we got off the gold standard and went to the petrodollar, with the Saudis backing the dollar pretty much with OPEC oil. So this is a major deal which is being largely underplayed in the corporate media. So I just wanted to bring to all of you guys' attention that this is not a little deal. This is a major deal. It has much more to do than with just the local politics of the Saudi purge within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They are so influential, the Saudis, with their money in the United States, that Trump's really killing two birds with one stone. Number one, he presents this proposition to King Salman and his son and says, hey, either you clean this stuff up or I let you fall. He gets them to go along and to do it, and we now see that they are doing it. They're taking down the bad guys. That takes care of the terrorism problem, which you know now is going to greatly improve because Trump's just cut off their money and their support. But the next thing he's doing is he's also cutting off, as you can see with a lot of these people, particularly with Bandar Bush and Ben Al-Alal. These are guys who are very active in the United States, bringing billions and billions of dollars to buy influence in the United States with both political parties, huge control in the media, big interest in banks and banking and the energy business and everything else. So essentially what Trump has done is he's begun the first process of draining the swamp here in the United States by taking away their money. So the two major people that Trump are his enemies, of course, is radical Islam and, of course, the deep state here in the United States. And he's just dealt both of them a death blow with one move. With one move. This negotiation, or this, whatever he did when he sat down with King Salman and Prince Mohammed, whatever he told them, whatever deal he cut, or whatever threat he made, worked. And it actually hit two birds with one stone. The two biggest enemies Trump faces, the radical Islamic terror issue, he just dealt with that, and he also dealt with the swamp here in the United States because he just took out a lot of their money. A lot of their money. So, an absolutely incredible stroke of genius by Trump, an incredible foreign policy move, and I think in 2020, in the next couple of years, we're going to see the effects of what is happening right now are going to be very obvious in 2020, and it's going to be an extraordinary thing to see. Absolutely extraordinary. Let's just go real quickly through just a couple of the bullet points that I've got down here just so we don't forget anything. Of course, I have pointed out the presidential administrations from Carter all the way up to Obama, totally in the tank for the Saudis, bought and paid for. Every single one of them. We've talked about the deep connections to the Bushes, Bandar Bush, and their close association with the oil business, their deep involvement in 9/11. We also know that they are the most radical sponsors and primary money men for Wahhabism. They fund over 70% of the madrasas and promote most of the radical Islam around the world. Of course, we've talked much about Prince Bandar Bush. We know what he's all about. Totally rotten to the core. He was rotten. He was exposed big time in the 28 pages that were released, which is essentially, those 28 pages are why you can sue the Saudi government right now. And Bandar Bush, up to his eyeballs in it. And let's not forget how close he was with George W. Bush and Bush 41 as well. Let's not forget that in the days leading up to 9/11, Bandar Bush was in Washington, as was the bin Laden family on the morning of 9/11, meeting with Bush 41 at a meeting for the Carlyle Group, which is a joint business that Bushes have with the bin Ladens. Let's see. Yes, another thing that happened, we learned last week. We actually learned about it this week, but apparently last week, Prince Bandar Bush, had his $135 million spread in Aspen, Colorado. They booted all of his. He had like 100 people that worked there just to maintain it. They booted him out, and it's been under security for the past week. So it looks like they're going to confiscate his $135 million spread in Aspen, Colorado. Bandar Bush won't be needing that anymore. Something tells me he's going to be sitting into exile with a lot of these other guys. The property was actually had been listed two different times for sale. It's now been taken off the market as well. So my guess is the Trump administration is going to confiscate that $135 million property in Aspen, Colorado. They're going to take it from Bandar Bush. He won't be needing it. And let's not forget that Bandar Bush was the Saudi's most famous arm dealer, known for taking hundreds of millions of dollars in kickbacks. He just got busted with a big kickback deal over in the UK. It was quite embarrassing. He was, of course, the former ambassador to the U.S., the former head of Saudi intelligence. That's back during the 9/11 thing. Of course, that gets into Bob Mueller and a lot of things, because remember, Bob Mueller was the head of the FBI back then. Don't even have time to go there. But Mueller has a close association with Bandar Bush. We know that Bandar Bush was the one who supplied the curveball, which curveball was the person that was supposedly the inside source on weapons of mass destruction to Bush and Cheney, who the Brits told him was full of bullshit, but they went ahead and used him anyway. That was Bandar Bush that gave us curveball, who later came out in interviews and said, yeah, I was giving them lines of bullshit, and they knew I was lying to them, but they just kept saying, yeah, just keep telling us that stuff. He's like, well, this ain't really true, right? We don't care. We're just going to keep paying you, and you keep talking. We just need to have a source that we can use that says that there's weapons of mass destruction there. You just keep talking, and we'll keep the money coming. So that was Curveball, brought to us by Bandar Bush, who was hanging around the White House an awful lot in the days leading up to 9/11. Of course, we know that Bandar Bush and Saudi intelligence deeply connected to U.S. intelligence, to the intelligence in the UK, and are essentially locked at the hip with Israeli intelligence. So basically, you can see right now that the Bushes and the Clintons and others are probably shaking in their boots right now because, Bandar Bush and some of these other players, they know a lot. They have a lot of information about a lot of things and what they will do to try to get themselves out of trouble, and what they will do to try to save their neck, and what information the Saudi government will learn, what King Salman and Prince Mohammed will learn, and what information that they learn that they will pass on to President Trump remains to be seen. But you can expect that they're going to get a lot of information, probably a lot of the stuff they already know. My guess is when Trump went over to Saudi Arabia, he probably already had a list. He probably already had a list of these guys. He probably said, these princes, this guy, this guy, this guy, here's a list. Every one of these guys, we know what they're up to. We know they're funding terrorism. We know they're involved in this. We know they're paying off politicians. We know they're doing this and doing that. So I think Trump probably already had a list for Prince Salman, or King Salman and Prince Bandar, and probably said, here's the guys you need to take down. So this is, again, it's not getting much play in the media, but it should, and I think that it's much bigger than what it appears on the surface right now. And I think when we get a couple of years down the road from where we are now, that we are going to see the impact and feel the impact of what is happening over the past few days and continues to happen in Saudi Arabia right now. This was a massive, massive play by President Trump. This was a plot, this was a plan that he obviously put together, well-coordinated plan, well-thought-out plan, and it kills two major birds with one stone. It's the beginning of the end of Wahhabism and the war on terror, and it's also the beginning of the end, or certainly coming to the beginning of the end, of the Saudi influence in the United States, bankrolling the swamp. The swamp monsters have just been deprived of their funding, making it much easier to take them down too. So Trump has drained is now draining the swamp in Saudi Arabia, and the swamp here in the United States will be next. You can bet on that. Let's watch and see what he does next. I bet he's thought this thing. He's way ahead of where all of us are. We're just watching and reacting. I think he's way ahead of where all of us are. Let's just keep watching. But don't underestimate what you see happening in Saudi Arabia right now. It's huge. Thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate all the support, comments, and all that kind of stuff. I love you guys, man. Have a good night. See ya. Bye.